When your neighbor destroys your fence, you won't believe how I reacted. Sarah Jenkins had lived in her suburban home for over 15 years, meticulously maintaining her property and creating a peaceful sanctuary in her backyard garden. The single-story craftsman with sage green siding had been her haven since the divorce, a place where she'd slowly rebuilt her life and found joy in the simple pleasures of homeownership. Her garden in particular was her pride and joy. A carefully cultivated space featuring raised beds of vegetables, flowering perennials that bloomed in coordinated succession throughout the growing season, and a small pond with water lilies that attracted hummingbirds and butterflies. One Thursday afternoon in April, Sarah returned home from her job as a high school librarian, looking forward to spending the evening hours tending to her early spring plantings. The weather had been particularly cooperative lately, and her garden was beginning to show promising signs of the abundant beauty to come. She pulled into her driveway, gathering her bag and a small box of donated books she brought home to catalog, when something unusual caught her eye. The familiar line of her backyard seemed different, more exposed somehow. Sarah frowned, setting down her things on the front porch and walking around the side of the house to investigate. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. The 6-foot wooden fence separating her yard from her new neighbor's property, the fence that had stood for more than a decade, had been completely dismantled. Not just a section or two, but the entire length of it. Wooden panels lay scattered across her carefully mulched flower beds, crushing her prized perennials. Several fence posts had been roughly yanked from the ground, leaving ugly holes in the lawn. Her purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, and the delicate columbines she'd nurtured from seed were flattened beneath splintered wood. What on earth? Sarah whispered, her voice lost in the suddenly too open space. The destruction was methodical, not the result of a storm or accident. Someone had deliberately taken down the entire fence. Her gaze drifted to her neighbor's property, where Richard Wilson had moved in just 3 months ago after the Andersons, a lovely retired couple who had always commented admiringly on her garden, had relocated to Arizona to be closer to their grandchildren. Sarah had made polite but limited contact with Richard since his arrival. He seemed perpetually busy, often coming and going at odd hours in his sleek black SUV. Their interactions had been cordial but brief, a wave while collecting the mail, a quick hello while taking out the trash. Nothing to suggest any issues or concerns. Confused and increasingly upset, Sarah pulled out her phone and began taking photographs of the damage. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the destruction, highlighting the extent of what had been done. She noted with growing distress that some of her irrigation lines had been severed where they ran near the fence line, and the small solar lights that illuminated the garden path had been carelessly tossed aside, several of them broken. As the reality of the situation sank in, Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. This was more than just property damage, it was an invasion. The fence had provided privacy, security, and a defined boundary for her sanctuary. Now her private space was exposed, vulnerable to prying eyes and uninvited access. She knelt beside a crushed, bleeding heart plant, carefully lifting the broken stems and feeling a surge of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. 15 years of carefully tending this space, of finding healing and purpose in nurturing growing things, and someone had carelessly destroyed a portion of it without so much as a conversation or warning. Standing amid the debris as the evening light began to fade, Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision. This would not stand. Whatever had happened here, whoever was responsible, she would get answers, and she would make this right. After thoroughly documenting the damage with her phone, Sarah stood in her garden for several long minutes, trying to compose herself. Confrontation had never been her strong suit. Years of working in a library had honed her skills in quiet diplomacy and gentle redirection rather than direct conflict. The thought of marching next door to demand answers made her heart race uncomfortably, but as she looked at her violated garden space once more, a steely resolve settled in her chest. Drawing a deep breath, Sarah smoothed her cardigan and walked purposefully around the block to her neighbor's front door. Richard Wilson's house, nearly identical to hers in layout but painted a stark white with black trim, seemed to glare at her as she approached. His pristine lawn was a stark contrast to her more natural, cottage-style gardening. The black SUV sat in the driveway, confirming he was home. Sarah rang the doorbell, fighting the urge to fidget as she heard footsteps approaching. The door swung open to reveal Richard, mid-40s, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt despite the late hour, his expression shifting from neutral to recognition to something like annoyance. "Yes, what can I do for you?" His tone was clipped, professional but cold. "I'm Sarah from next door," she began, though she was certain he knew exactly who she was. "I just returned home to find my fence completely dismantled, the one between our properties." She paused, giving him room to explain or apologize. Richard leaned against his doorframe, arms crossing over his chest. "Yeah, I had it taken down this morning. No apology, no explanation, just a flat statement of fact." Sarah blinked, momentarily stunned by his cavalier admission. You had my fence taken down without asking or even notifying me. Look, Richard sighed as if explaining something to a child. That fence was blocking the natural light for the home office I'm setting up. And according to my research, it's technically on my property line anyway. He gestured vaguely toward his house. The view is much better now, don't you think? Opens up both our spaces. I don't think Sarah started, but Richard continued. I had a survey done when I moved in. The property line is actually about 8 inches beyond where that fence was standing. He glanced at his watch. If you're concerned about privacy, I'm planning to put in some decorative shrubs eventually. Much more aesthetically pleasing than that weathered old fence. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. May I see this survey? She asked, working to keep her voice level. Because I have documentation showing that fence was entirely on my property and has been for over 10 years. Richard's expression hardened. I don't have it on hand. My lawyer has the paperwork. A clear fabrication, Sarah thought, noting how he wouldn't meet her eyes. Even if, and that's a big if, the fence line was disputed, the proper course of action would have been to discuss it with me first, Sarah said, her normally soft voice gaining an edge she scarcely recognized. You've damaged my garden, cut my irrigation lines, and destroyed property that doesn't belong to you. Richard straightened, his casual demeanor evaporating. I improved both our properties today. If you're going to be difficult about this, we can get lawyers involved. His tone became dismissive. I got a conference call in 5 minutes with Tokyo. If you're really attached to having an ugly fence, we can discuss reasonable options later. But that old eyesore isn't going back up. This isn't over, Sarah said, her hands trembling not from fear now, but from a righteous anger she hadn't felt in years. You had no right. Have a good evening, Sarah. Richard interrupted, already closing his door. I need to prepare for my call. The door clicked shut in her face, leaving Sarah standing on the porch, a curious mixture of fury and disbelief coursing through her. In all her years of homeownership, through noisy neighbors and property tax disputes, she had never encountered such blatant disrespect and entitlement. As she walked back to her violated garden in the fading light, one thing became abundantly clear. Richard Wilson had no idea who he was dealing with. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind racing with indignation and strategies. By Saturday morning, she had formulated a plan. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about standing her ground against a bully who clearly thought she would simply back down. First, she needed to confirm what she already knew to be true. Sarah started by clearing out the hall closet where she kept important documents, spreading folders across her dining room table until she found what she needed: her property deed, the closing documents from 15 years ago, and a survey that had been conducted 5 years prior when she considered adding a small greenhouse to the back corner of her yard. Opening her laptop, she created a detailed spreadsheet to organize her findings. The original property line documentation confirmed what she suspected. The fence had been installed well within her property boundary, a full 16 inches from the actual line. The previous owners had intentionally set it back to allow room for maintenance from both sides. There was simply no way Richard's claim could be valid. Next, Sarah drove to the county records office, waiting patiently for the clerk to search for the official property maps for their subdivision. The elderly gentleman behind the counter seemed delighted by her methodical approach, offering to make certified copies of all relevant documents. While there, she also picked up information on local ordinances regarding property boundaries and fence regulations. You know, the clerk confided as he stamped the official seal on her copies, we've had 3 people from your neighborhood in here requesting the same information recently. One fellow was quite insistent that there were errors in the original subdivision mapping. Tall man, black SUV, rather dismissive attitude, Sarah asked. The clerk's knowing smile was all the confirmation she needed. On her way home, Sarah stopped at the local hardware store, purchasing temporary garden fencing and stakes to secure her property in the interim. The owner, Mr. Delaney, raised his eyebrows when she explained the situation. Wilson, the new guy in the old Anderson place? He shook his head. He was in here last week asking strange questions about adverse possession laws and property boundaries, seemed fixated on the idea of reclaiming land. This information sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Back home, a quick internet search revealed that adverse possession, essentially claiming property through continuous use, required years of occupation, not months. Richard couldn't possibly have legal grounds, but his intent was becoming clearer. That afternoon, Sarah walked down the block to visit Eleanor Peterson, who had lived on the street for over 30 years. Over tea and homemade scones, Eleanor revealed that Richard had already complained to her about her rose trellis supposedly encroaching on his side of their adjoining property line. He threatened to have his lawyers contact me, Eleanor said, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she poured more tea. At my age, I was ready to just take it down to avoid trouble, but my grandson insisted we wait. By Sunday, Sarah had spoken with 5 neighbors, discovering that Richard had approached 3 of them with similar boundary disputes. A pattern was emerging of a man systematically attempting to intimidate his way into expanding his property boundaries on all sides. Her most illuminating conversation came when she managed to reach Betty Anderson, Richard's house's previous owner, now living in Scottsdale. Property dispute? Heavens no, Betty said over the phone. In 23 years, we never had a single boundary issue with any neighbor. We were all very clear on our lot lines. Harold and I specifically checked with Sarah. That would be you, dear. Before we put in those hydrangea bushes near your fence. Armed with substantial documentation and neighbor testimonials, Sarah filed a detailed police report for property damage on Monday morning. The officer who took her statement seemed skeptical at first, but grew increasingly concerned as she methodically presented her evidence. This appears to be a civil matter primarily, he explained, but the destruction of property is something we can document. Have you contacted your insurance company? Sarah nodded. She had already scheduled an adjuster to assess the damage and had compiled photos of the fence before and after, including several from her garden club's visit the previous summer. As she drove to work Monday morning, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm determination replacing her initial shock and anger. Richard Wilson had clearly underestimated her, assuming the quiet librarian next door would be an easy target. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The following week brought a noticeable shift in the neighborhood atmosphere. Sarah installed her temporary garden fencing with help from Mr. Delaney's son on Tuesday evening, marking a clear boundary where her fence had stood. She noticed Richard watching from his kitchen window, phone pressed to his ear, his expression unreadable. Wednesday morning, Sarah left for work as usual, backing carefully out of her driveway. When she returned that afternoon, Richard's gleaming black SUV was parked in a way that partially blocked her access, forcing her to maneuver awkwardly to reach her garage. She considered confronting him again, but decided against giving him the satisfaction of seeing her frustration. On Thursday, the pattern repeated, his vehicle positioned just far enough into the shared street space to complicate her entry, but not technically blocking enough to justify a parking complaint. A deliberate annoyance just subtle enough to seem coincidental to outsiders. Testing boundaries, murmured Sarah to herself, recognizing the passive-aggressive tactic for what it was. Friday evening brought a new development. Sarah had invited her book club friends over, their monthly gathering rotating between members' homes. As they discussed Donna Tartt's secret history over wine and appetizers, the conversation inevitably turned to Sarah's fence situation. Her friend's indignation and support lifted her spirits, making her feel less alone in the standoff. As the evening wound down around 10 p.m., Jennifer, one of the book club members, came rushing back to Sarah's door just minutes after leaving. "You need to come see this," she said, her voice tight with anger. Outside, Jennifer pointed to her car tires and those of 2 other book club members. Behind each vehicle lay several roofing nails positioned precisely where the cars would back over them. "This isn't random," said Jennifer, a contractor who recognized the nails as specialized roofing hardware, not something that would accidentally scatter on a residential street. Sarah's hands trembled as she helped collect the nails, placing them in a plastic bag while another friend called the non-emergency police line. The responding officer took statements and examined the nails but explained that without direct evidence of who placed them, there was little they could do beyond filing a report. "I'll be installing security cameras tomorrow," Sarah told her friends as they finally departed, using flashlights to check their cars once more. The weekend brought more subtle provocations. The sprinklers on Richard's property mysteriously malfunctioned, spraying directly onto Sarah's side and soaking her temporary fencing. A delivery she was expecting was marked as delivered but was nowhere to be found, until it mysteriously appeared, water damaged, beside her garbage bins on Sunday morning. Sleep became increasingly elusive for Sarah. Each night she found herself startling at ordinary neighborhood sounds. A car door closing, a dog barking, wondering if Richard was escalating his campaign against her. Dark circles formed under her eyes as the days passed, her normally neat appearance showing signs of strain. On Monday morning, Sarah was deadheading her salvaged perennials when Eleanor Peterson's grandson Michael stopped by. "Gran told me about your situation," he said, leaning over the temporary fence. "I installed a security system for her after that Wilson guy started making threats. Want me to set one up for you too?" Sarah gratefully accepted, and by Monday evening, discreet cameras monitored her property from several angles. The first footage they captured was of Richard walking along the property line after dark, measuring tape in hand, pausing to take pictures of her temporary fencing. On Tuesday, Sarah received a certified letter from Wilson Properties LLC, claiming she was in violation of boundary agreements and demanding the removal of her temporary fencing within 48 hours. The letter was signed by Richard Wilson, Esquire. Apparently, he was representing himself as an attorney, though Sarah's quick online search of the State Bar Association yielded no record of his licensure. That night, sitting at her kitchen table with the threatening letter before her, Sarah felt her home, once her sanctuary, transforming into a battleground. Even with supportive neighbors and mounting evidence, the psychological toll was becoming almost unbearable. For the first time since Richard had torn down her fence, she found herself wondering if 15 years of memories were worth the fight that lay ahead. By Wednesday evening, Sarah had reached her breaking point. The combination of sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and Richard's escalating harassment had worn her down to a shell of her normally composed self. Her principal had even gently suggested she take a personal day after finding her tearfully organizing returned books in the library's biography section. That evening, the Oakwood Community Association was holding its monthly meeting at the local community center. Sarah had attended sporadically over the years but had never brought up personal issues. Tonight, however, she arrived early, a folder of documentation tucked under her arm, her resolve wavering with each step toward the building. The association president, Douglas Freeman, a retired judge known for his fairness and no-nonsense approach, called the meeting to order promptly at 7 p.m. Sarah sat quietly through discussions of the summer block party planning and updates on the community garden expansion. When Douglas opened the floor for new business, Sarah raised her hand, surprised by how much it trembled. I have a situation I'd like to share with the community," she began, her librarian's voice barely carrying across the room. As Sarah recounted the fence destruction and subsequent harassment, her voice grew steadier, bolstered by the attentive faces around her. She presented the facts methodically, just as she had documented them, sharing photographs of the damage and the threatening letters she'd received. "I don't know what to do anymore," she concluded. "I've lived here 15 years without a single dispute, and now I'm afraid in my own home." The silence that followed lasted only moments before Eleanor Peterson spoke up from the back row. "Richard Wilson questioned my property line too, told me my rose trellis was encroaching and needed to be moved or he'd take legal action." Another voice joined in, Mark Jeffries from 2 streets over. "He tried the same thing with our shared fence line, claimed a professional survey showed it was 6 inches into his property. When I asked to see the survey, he always had some excuse. He told me my oak tree's roots were damaging his foundation and demanded I remove a 70-year-old tree at my expense," added Sylvia Chen, a normally quiet resident. "I consulted an arborist who found absolutely no foundation issues." One by one, 7 different households shared similar stories of boundary disputes, intimidation tactics, and legal threats from Richard Wilson. A pattern emerged of a systematic campaign targeting primarily older residents, single women, and families who appeared unlikely to mount significant resistance. Douglas Freeman's expression grew increasingly grave as he listened. "This appears to be a coordinated pattern of behavior designed to expand his property holdings through intimidation," he finally stated, his judicial background evident in his precise assessment. "Ms. Jenkins, I believe we have sufficient community testimony to take collective action." By the meeting's end, a multi-pronged approach had been developed. Douglas volunteered to draft a formal cease and desist letter on behalf of the community association, citing the multiple documented incidents and the collective evidence of harassment. "I still have contacts in the legal community," he explained, "and this type of predatory behavior toward established residents will not stand in Oakwood." The association treasurer, Patricia Williams, proposed using community funds to hire a single professional surveyor to definitively mark all property lines adjacent to Richard's home, creating an irrefutable record. The motion passed unanimously. Most surprisingly to Sarah, 3 different neighbors, including Michael Peterson and the Ramirez family next door to Eleanor, volunteered to help clean up the remaining debris in her yard and replace her temporary fencing with something more substantial until a permanent solution could be implemented. "We'll make it a community workday this Saturday," suggested Carlos Ramirez. "Bring tools, lumber, and plenty of refreshments. My brother-in-law manages the hardware store downtown and can give us a discount on materials." As the meeting adjourned, Sarah found herself surrounded by neighbors offering phone numbers, security camera footage, and statements for her records. Some she knew well, others she had only nodded to in passing over the years. The invisible threads of community, which had seemed so tenuous in her isolation, now materialized as a tangible safety net around her. Walking home that evening, flanked by Eleanor and Douglas who insisted on escorting her, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. The weight on her shoulders hadn't disappeared, but it had been redistributed among many willing hands. The Saturday community workday transformed Sarah's violated garden space. By mid-afternoon, 15 neighbors had cleared debris, replanted damaged areas, and installed a sturdy temporary fence reinforced with metal posts, not something anyone's going to casually dismantle, as Carlos Ramirez put it. Richard remained conspicuously absent during the activity, his blinds drawn despite the occasional curious glances toward his property. Douglas Freeman delivered the association's formal letter to Richard on Monday morning, with two association board members present as witnesses. According to Douglas, Richard had appeared momentarily startled by the official delegation before quickly recovering his composure and accepting the document with a dismissive comment about neighborhood overreaction. 3 days later, Sarah received a response not from Richard directly, but from an actual attorney at a downtown firm. The letter acknowledged the unfortunate misunderstanding regarding property boundaries and suggested a neutral mediation session. While maintaining that her fence had indeed encroached on his property, the tone was markedly different from Richard's previous communications, less aggressive, more formal, and with a subtle hint of retreat. "He's hired legitimate representation," Douglas remarked when Sarah showed him the letter. "That's actually a good sign. Real attorneys tend to counsel their clients away from indefensible positions." The association had already contracted with Precision Boundary Surveys, a well-respected local firm with no previous connection to either Sarah or Richard, to conduct comprehensive surveys of all properties adjoining Richard's lot. The surveyor, a methodical woman named Margaret Chen, arrived the following Tuesday with assistance and state-of-the-art equipment. "We'll be establishing boundaries based on the original subdivision plats and all subsequent legally recorded adjustments," she explained to the small group of interested neighbors who had gathered to watch. "Everything will be documented with GPS precision and officially filed with the county." Richard emerged briefly to speak with Ms. Chen, his demeanor noticeably more subdued as she explained the process. When he attempted to suggest specific measurement approaches, she politely but firmly directed him to the standardized protocols her team would be following. "This is how professional boundary disputes are resolved, Mr. Wilson," Sarah overheard Ms. Chen saying. "The math and the records will tell us where the lines truly fall." The survey work continued for 2 days, with meticulous measurements taken and small metal markers driven into the ground at key points. On Friday afternoon, Ms. Chen presented her findings to both Sarah and Richard, with Douglas present as a neutral third party. As the detailed maps were spread across Sarah's dining room table, the results were unambiguous. Not only had Sarah's fence been entirely within her property line, but it had actually stood nearly 16 inches inside her boundary, exactly as her documentation had indicated. "The property line is here," Ms. Chen indicated, pointing to the metal markers now visible along the boundary, "and the original fence footings were here, well within Ms. Jenkins' property." Richard, dressed in what Sarah assumed was his most intimidating business suit, studied the survey silently, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its previous arrogance. "There appears to have been a discrepancy between my preliminary research and these findings," he said carefully. "While I maintain that my actions were based on good faith interpretations of available information, I recognize that the official survey presents a definitive boundary determination." The mediation that followed was facilitated by a professional mediator suggested by the community association. Richard, flanked by his attorney, initially attempted to negotiate minimal responsibility, offering to pay half the cost of a new fence. "My client acknowledges the boundary determination but maintains that the existing fence was aging and aesthetically undesirable," his attorney argued. "The aesthetic quality of Ms. Jenkins' fence was not for your client to determine," Douglas countered, the years of judicial experience evident in his measured tone. "And its removal without permission constitutes property destruction regardless of its condition." After 2 hours of negotiation, Richard reluctantly agreed to cover the full cost of a new fence, along with restoration of the damaged landscaping. His only concession was a compromise on the fence height, 5.5 feet instead of the original 6 feet, which Sarah accepted primarily to bring the matter to a close. "I misunderstood the property boundaries," Richard stated for the record, though Sarah noted he never actually apologized for his actions. "I'm willing to make appropriate." When the certified check from Richard arrived the following Monday, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than allowing him to control any aspect of the reconstruction, she decided to take charge of the project entirely. "I'll need this made payable to me directly," she informed Richard's attorney via email. "As the wrong party, I'll be overseeing the restoration of my property according to the specifications in our agreement." The attorney's prompt acquiescence suggested they were eager to close the matter with minimal additional conflict. Sarah had never considered herself particularly assertive before this ordeal, but something had fundamentally shifted within her. The quiet librarian who had once painstakingly avoided confrontation now found herself researching fencing companies with the same methodical determination she'd once reserved for organizing the library's reference section. After interviewing 3 contractors, she selected Cornerstone Fencing, a family-owned business with stellar reviews and a portfolio of beautifully crafted cedar privacy fences. Their owner, James Cornerstone, walked the property line with Sarah, listening attentively to her needs and suggesting design options that would complement both properties while providing the privacy she required. We can include a subtle design element along the top that adds visual interest without sacrificing security, he suggested, sketching a gentle art pattern that would crown each panel. And the natural cedar will weather to a beautiful silver gray over time, blending with your garden aesthetic. The installation began 2 weeks later with the Cornerstone team carefully setting posts exactly on the surveyed line, ensuring each was perfectly plumb before proceeding. Sarah found herself coming home during lunch breaks to watch the progress, a sense of reclamation growing with each panel that rose along her boundary. Richard made himself scarce during the construction, his SUV notably absent during work hours. Through her kitchen window, Sarah occasionally noticed him observing the progress in the evenings, his expression inscrutable from a distance. As the fence neared completion, Sarah felt inspired to reimagine her garden rather than simply restore it. Where her previous perennial beds had run parallel to the fence, she now designed a more dynamic layout with curved pathways and raised beds that created distinct garden rooms. The destruction had, paradoxically, offered an opportunity for creative renewal. Eleanor Peterson connected Sarah with her garden club, whose members arrived one Saturday with divisions from their own gardens, hostas, dailies, astilbe, and ferns, to help replant the damaged areas. What had begun as a solitary restoration project evolved into a community celebration of resilience and renewal. "You know what would really complete this?" suggested Carlos Ramirez as they planted the last of the donated perennials. A neighbor of a gathering to reclaim the space, a fence-warming party. The idea resonated with Sarah. For weeks, her home had been associated with conflict and stress. A celebration would help transform that energy and reclaim her sense of peace. Invitations went out to everyone who had supported her, and after considerable deliberation, to Richard Wilson as well. "Do you really want him there?" Douglas Freeman asked when she mentioned the inclusion. "It's not about wanting him there," Sarah replied. "It's about showing him that his actions didn't diminish this community. It strengthened it." On a perfect June evening, Sarah's backyard filled with neighbors bearing potluck dishes and garden gifts. Paper lanterns hung from shepherd's hooks along the new fence, casting a warm glow as twilight descended. Children played tag across the lawn while adults admired the fence and renovated garden spaces. Richard didn't attend. Sarah hadn't truly expected him to, but his absence felt insignificant amid the warmth and laughter that filled her garden. The new fence, with its subtle arch detailing and rich cedar fragrance, stood as both boundary and backdrop to the gathering, no longer representing conflict but protection for the community space within. As dusk deepened into evening, Sarah found herself seated on her patio steps beside Eleanor and Douglas, watching fireflies rise above the newly planted gardens. "I never thought I'd say this," Sarah admitted, "but in a strange way I'm grateful for what happened. Not for Richard's behavior," she clarified, "but for showing me how much stronger I am than I realized, and how connected we all are." Eleanor patted her hand. "Sometimes it takes a storm to show us what's firmly rooted." In the following weeks, Sarah planted climbing roses along the fence line, a variety known for its hardiness and spectacular blooms. Where there had once been a simple boundary, there now stood a living tapestry that would grow more beautiful with passing years.